This is Duke University.
Before we open up the floor, I'm going to invoke moderator's privilege to just ask everybody to comment in a very media sort of quote style. I'm talking 45 to 60 seconds on something that May had just brought up now. And I'm thinking here about this interest that you all have together, about this relationship between empowerment and art. I'm thinking here about Fanon, Aristotle. A professor at Princeton in philosophy recently wrote a book called Only a Promise of Happiness. And this is what he discussed about the concept of beauty. And so I'm wondering, as we're talking about empire, oppression, colonialism, freedom, art, witness, what does beauty mean in Malcolm's legacy?
All right. Yes.
Okay.
You want to go?
Go ahead.
Okay. Not that I have an answer, that's why I'm jumping in. I mean, I talked about it briefly in the book. One of the underexplored ideas about Malcolm is his kind of discussion on kind of cultural politics. At one of the founding meetings of the OAAU, he lays out a blueprint for what he sees to be the role of black art. And I talk about it in relationship to kind of Fanon and the formation of kind of national culture and the role of art in kind of creating an engaged kind of national culture. Not one that's kind of backward looking in the kind of critique that Fanon had about negritude, but one that's more about a forward looking kind of idea about production of art that's about shaping a new kind of national consciousness. So I have 3 minutes. I know. So I talk about that in the context of Malcolm and his OAAU discussion about the role of art and culture, because it obviously gets picked up quickly by the Black Arts Movement and Leroy Jones and Baraka and a whole host of others who kind of took on this imperative, and then of course hip hop kind of picks up the baton from it. So I think we can't think about Malcolm as kind of brilliant as he was as an ideologue, and I mean that in the most kind of affirming way, and a strategist, but also as one who is a cultural theorist. I think it's important to see Malcolm as a theorist of popular culture or the role of culture in kind of shaping a kind of critical consciousness in the kind of Saidian way. So.
Very. May, Hisham?
I'm biased because I've always functioned in the world of the intersection, as the moderator has said, between art and activism. I was part of this group called Black Arts Collective, and it was inspired by the Black Arts Movement. I think in terms of the question of how Malcolm saw beauty, I'm going to have to sit and meditate about that for a while. But I think Hisham's presentation hits on something that I think scholars still need to do a lot more interrogation. When I was looking through his prison diary, his letters that he had written in prison to his brother Filbert, one of the interesting things I noticed is at the beginning of some of his letters, he would quote poetry. And one of them had Omar Khayyam on it as well. But we don't look for that. And it's actually maybe a little hard to decode because he only puts, I think, okay on it. And that's all he puts. So how would you know that was Omar Khayyam unless you were familiar with his poetry?
Interesting. Very.
Malcolm and beauty. Let me say 3 quick things. If you look at the ethnography, Malcolm was the ethnographer. If you look at the diaries, Malcolm was an incredible ethnographer, right? So sailing down the Nile in Mecca. In Mecca, he says parts of this city look like 7th century Arabia. Other parts look like suburban Miami. Right? Sort of his eye for detail, what he writes about history. So that he's an ethnographer. Second point is the daughters let us access his personal library, and some of the books you see there. Books like by Sartre. There's an English translation of Jean-Paul Sartre's book, Black Orpheus, and it is incredible.
Yeah.
Because it is, the translation errors are circled, typos are circled, sentences are underlined. So he was a very careful reader of philosophy. So that book, his engagement with the general French Pan-African tradition, right? He had books from Présence Africaine, which was the French negritude movement, which appeared, inspired by the Harlem Renaissance, and appeared in Paris in the 20s and 30s. So he had books from that tradition, so he was very much aware of these transatlantic encounters, the role of poetry and music. So as a Muslim, he was ambivalent about music and the lifestyle that he used to live and so on, but at the same time, he saw music as part of emancipation. Music is part of a liberation movement. A final thing on Malcolm and Beauty is just his personal style.
Oh, yeah.
His demeanor and so on. There's a wonderful essay by June Jordan where she says she met Malcolm as a young student when he came to speak at Barnard, right? And she touched him, and she says he was threadbare, right? The man was threadbare. He never wore much, but he carried himself with a certain dignity, didn't wear much, was very ascetic. And you see, what's amazing is you see that style among young Malcolmites today, right? The goatee, the horn glasses, the arched back, and so on. I see it around the world. I mean, I look at Malcolm's global influence, and I can spot a Malcolmite from afar because of that aesthetic, because of that particular understanding of beauty.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you very much. We're going to open up for questions, and they are questions. So if we could keep your questions to pointed discussions to the panelists. We have Sheikh Safi. What would you say in terms of our time, so I can keep an eye?
I think we can take 15 minutes.
Okay, great.
Well, you focus on the relationship to global Islam, but I'm interested if you could comment on Malcolm's relationship to Vietnam and the Vietnam War, because he had early, even before the American escalation, he voiced opposition to it. And this is also a project of African-Asian unity. So if you have something to add about that, I appreciate it.
Is it directed at anybody or just the panel? Yeah, I didn't fully flesh out my quote that you guys asked us to also submit, my favorite quote of Malcolm's, but one of mine is, you remember Dien Bien Phu, right, where Malcolm invokes kind of the French defeat in Vietnam as this kind of, in many ways, it's a kind of rhetorical device Malcolm uses in the message to the grassroots to remind the audience about this kind of international struggle against white supremacy. But for those who don't know about it, it's kind of a command too. So as you said, Malcolm is talking about Vietnam before it became kind of more popular and mainstream, and obviously before even Dr. King. And we were on the radio earlier today, me, Jamila, she's in the audience, I think, right? And Omid, and we were talking about the kind of consensus narrative that goes along with this. Malcolm is universalist and post-racial after Mecca. The consensus narrative is he became more like Dr. King, when in fact Dr. King became more like Malcolm.
So my question is mostly to Maytha and Sohail. It seemed that the concluding points that we were taking is you talk about Malcolm and what he might say about injustices or challenges within the global context. And I was actually curious to if you had taken a step back and said, what does it mean that we are taking a figure like Malcolm X and using him to critique injustices that are continuing today? And what influence do you think Malcolm has on the people who really have an opportunity to change the issues that you brought up that are of concern?
I don't know if it was clear or if I was coherent, but that's what I was trying to say with my preface, that I don't intend to invoke Malcolm as this is Malcolm or that is Malcolm, but this moment left us that. So if this moment left us that, how do we look at our current moment? I think as a historian, I think the contextual variables that existed then obviously are different. So we're dealing with different, also a different moment. We're dealing with a moment of neoliberalism. So the idea of the nation state is a completely different concept. And the way that Malcolm talks about nationalism and even calls forth for and is inspired by these national decolonization projects is a completely different moment. And I don't know what he would have to say to this moment. But I'm just looking at the remnants, the shatterings, I guess, and seeing what matches up to today.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree in a lot of ways. I mean, I think, we still call him Malcolm X, right? He's going to keep that X as long as the conditions that produced it continue to persist,
Yeah.
right? So I think, to me, I still think Malcolm is relevant. In fact, clairvoyant in his ability to see the kind of limitations and shortcomings of the civil rights project, and its relationship to kind of expanding American empire. I mean, I think it's undeniable that Malcolm's relevance is still around today. So I see his utility, along with some of the kind of limitations in terms of like using him as well, because as May's talking about, in a neoliberal mode where the nation state has become kind of a conduit and emptied of its kind of significance, though South America and the kind of regional dynamic taking place there might give us some pause to kind of, abandoning the nation state. I think Malcolm could still be relevant, absolutely.
Well, I just reminded of something, because your other part of your question was the agency, I believe, the agency that's left with the way that we imagine Malcolm. Am I? Okay. I think the other thing that we have to be careful not to do is to look at Malcolm, skip 50 years, and say this is what he means. We have to look at the trajectory of people that he inspired, look at the way that he inspired the SNCC, Student Nonviolent, I'm sorry, I always get it, Coordinating Committee, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to respond to the '67 war. They were very popular for issuing a statement in support of Palestine and suffered brutal consequences of being defunded for that decision. And one of the key people in that movement was Stokely Carmichael, who Hisham brought up, who later becomes Kwame Ture, inspired the Black Panthers, who said they were children of Malcolm, Assata Shakur. We can think of countless other people. And these are the people that activists from Ferguson, Hands Up United people, Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders quote as their heroes. I can't tell you throughout the trip when we were in Palestine, if you ever want to talk about it, how many times people mentioned, oh, this is what Stokely Carmichael would say, oh, this is what Assata Shakur would say about this. And then they might bring up Malcolm, but they're kind of bringing up his legacy.
Hisham, I wanted to thank you for saying that Malcolm X should not be construed as a civil rights leader.
Oh, that's Hisham, right?
I'm sorry.
I'm Sohail, yeah.
Abbas.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
they've got your name tags.
We all look the same. Yeah.
Sorry, no, they got your name tags. So, but when I heard Frank Stasio say that on the radio, I immediately blanched. So thank you.
Yeah.
But I do have a question for Maytha. The last slide you put up was one where there was a quotation from Malcolm X comparing Zionism and communism. And this occurs, I guess, in the context of the height of the Cold War. Yep. So I was wondering if you might elaborate on that quotation and what its implications might be for the way in which we think about things now.
I am going to pull that up and look back at it. I don't remember the point. Yeah, I don't think, he says, let me show you where he says communism. Yes, here. Okay, so this Al-Muslimun interview was his last interview that he ever did, February 20th, 1965. He sent it in that night that he was in the hotel, and the next day he goes to the Autobahn. I think he was speaking to what Sohail was talking about, the kind of terror and fear that was constructed in how we spoke about communism. I mean, this is an interesting question because a lot of the communists, the socialists, the militant socialists will also take up Malcolm's legacy and say this is the direction he was going to go. He was going to abandon Islam and he was going to join us as comrades in the militant socialism movement. I don't know if that's necessarily clear, but maybe he's trumping or speaking to the fears and thinking about the audience that he's talking to. He's talking to a largely Arab Muslim audience. So there's a real fear of communism as well to that audience because the way that it's been marketed towards them is, especially the Saudis. For the Saudis, this is a real fear, right? And this is what Henry Kissinger actually manipulates in trying to get King Faisal to support jihadi movements, right? No, I mean, this is kind of the start of the Islamic fundamentalism because Henry Kissinger's like, you have to export your version of Islam to fight the godless communists, the Soviet Union. So he might have been speaking to that. I have to look back at the full context of the question to really properly answer it. I'm sorry, I just kind of like threw that one in. It's been a while since I visited that.
Do we have any more questions on the floor? Professor Safi, would you like to question anybody else? Okay, well, with that then, I want to thank you all for sitting through the first panel. Thank you to our panelists. We have coffee outside.